So welcome everybody. My name is Laura Horwood-Benton. I'm the Public Programming and Community Relations Librarian at Portsmouth Public Library in New Hampshire. And I'm saying that because we do often get folks, I know we have at least one person here from California today. So if you'd like to write in the chat and tell us where you're connecting from, even if it's in New Hampshire, what town you're in, that's always kind of cool to see where everybody's from. The city of Portsmouth is on the homelands of the Abenaki people, who have ongoing cultural and spiritual connections to this area. According to tribal oral tradition, Abenaki people have lived in the place called New Hampshire for more than 12,000 years, since before tribal memory. The Abenaki are part of a larger group of indigenous people who call themselves Wabanaki, or People of the Dawn, and form one of the many communities connected by a common language family. Here at Portsmouth Public Library, we're committed to acknowledging and honoring the human history tied to this land. If you have any questions about library programs, services, or anything else, you can feel free to ask me at the end of the program. And I want to say that we love hearing from you about what you'd like to see at the library and our programs in general. So I'm going to be sharing in the chat an online event feedback form that you can fill out. You'll not only help the library, you'll also be entered to win a library book bag. But I should say that if you win the raffle, you have to be able to pick it up. So maybe don't enter if you are connected from California today. I'm so excited to welcome Marianne O'Connor, so I'm going to turn it right over to her. And what I will say is, if you have any questions, feel free to put them in the chat. I'll be keeping tabs on questions, or you can save them until the end of Marianne's presentation, and we'll have a little time for questions and answers. So Marianne, over to you.
Okay. Hello, everyone, and thank you for being here. I'm so glad that you're here. Before we began the program, I was talking to Laura about how we planned this event for Portsmouth Library a year ago. Hard to believe that, you know, a year ago we would have thought we'd be doing the program this way, but here we are, and I'm happy to be doing it. I'm grateful to the Portsmouth Library. It's a library I've always wanted to hit. It's on my bucket list, so I'm really happy to be here. And how I'm going to do the program today is I'm going to share with you many stories. It's going to take about an hour to get through our whole program. And most of the stories are very friendly, kid-friendly, family-friendly. I do have kind of one scary story in here, but I will tell you when that story is coming up in case you have young children that might get too scared. I also have sound effects in the program. So don't be surprised if you hear woo, ghostly sounds. And for children as well, I've hidden ghosts in some of the slides, and you will see some ghosts appear and you will hear all kinds of spooky sounds, and it's a fun program. We're looking at a different Halloween season this year, and I don't know what it's going to look like, but people still love Halloween, and I've always loved Halloween. And so let's get started, shall we? I first published Haunted Hikes of New Hampshire in 2008, and you can see this picture. That's my very first promo shot that I did with a publicist that worked with me out of Publishing Works. That was my first publisher out of Exeter. And the idea came to me to put together a book about ghost stories because I thought there probably was one already. I was hearing ghost stories in the White Mountains, hiking with my father, and I really thought that somewhere there would be a collection of ghost stories, but there just really wasn't. That's the picture that's there on the right-hand side is a picture I took last year at a presentation at LL Bean. So that was my last publicity shot in 2019. In the middle, you'll see the second edition. I'll hold it up right here where you can't even see it, but the second edition came out last October, and my new publisher is Peter Randall right here in Portsmouth. The second edition came out as a result of the third printing I had of the first edition ran out of books, and the third printing was 10,000 books, and I really thought that that was going to last me until the turn of the next century or something. I didn't think that I would run out of books, but I did. So it put me in a position of, well, I need to find a new publisher. I'm going to add new stories that I've heard over the years. So I've been doing a lot of library shows since about 2009 when I first published. And the second edition includes many stories that I've heard from other people having done these presentations, including the first story that I'm about to share. And I would hear these stories and I would be, I don't want to call it an obsession, but just like very fascinated with finding out, is this a true story? Did this really happen? Does this place exist? And the first story you will see how that all came about, the one that I'm about to share with you. So do you believe in witches? I'll bet many of you out there have dressed as a witch for Halloween and put the green face on. I have a picture of me somewhere with a big pointy hat and dressed as a witch. And I have heard a lot of stories about, you know, quote, witches, women who were thought to be witches. And it always fascinated me. I know a story out of Alton, New Hampshire, where there was a supposed witch. Her name was Sarah Glidden. Haverhill, Massachusetts has a witch. The witch I'm going to be talking about in this first story is from New Hampton, New Hampshire. And in New Hampton, during the period of the Revolutionary War, the late 1770s, Granny Hyde was accused of being a witch in the town. She lived away from the village by herself, and anything that was happening in town that was unusual, it was always the fault of Granny Hyde. She was behind it. If something were to go wrong, your cow died, it was Granny Hyde. And one story that stood out with many people in town was a neighbor, a woman had gone to Granny Hyde to borrow some yarn, and Granny said no. And when the woman returned back to her house, there was a gopher in the middle of her kitchen standing up like a human. And this startled the woman so much she was convinced that Granny had taken the form of this gopher and transported herself into the woman's kitchen to scold her and bring all kinds of bad luck to her. So people began feeling that she was a witch and she needed to leave the town. She needed to be run out of town. She lived alone by the Pemigewasset River in a little cottage. And I first heard about this story of Granny Hyde from a presentation I did in Warner, New Hampshire. And again, this is usually how it happens. Someone will say, well, you must know the story of Granny Hyde. And I said, no, I don't know the story. So I was given a copy of a sermon, and it was written by a Reverend A.J. Gordon around 1905. And the sermon was given in Hull, Massachusetts. And this sermon has been shared with other reverends and other ministers. And so the story has been retold and retold as the witch's prophecy. And as I was reading it, Reverend Gordon described who the witch was, what she looked like, and specifically where she lived. She lived in a cottage on the eastern shores of the Pemigewasset River, where there was a mound and a ledge. And so there was a lot of description given into where this house was. And I just became really curious about if this house existed, if Granny Hyde was real. And so I would stop in New Hampton every now and then on my trips to the White Mountains, because I was like, I'm gonna find it. I'm gonna find this house. I'm gonna find where this house was. And if I can find the house, then I know the story was real. So the story goes that the residents in town really wanted to see Granny go. And one night, 5 men who were drinking by the tavern came up with a plan that they were going to go out to Granny's house and destroy it. And in doing so, she would leave town and she wouldn't be a nuisance anymore. So the 5 men waited until it got very dark. They disguised themselves, they put mud on their faces so they wouldn't be recognized, and they were drunken and rowdy, and they went out to her home and they destroyed her home. And as her house lay in ruins, Granny seemed to know who these 5 men were. She knew them by name, and she called out each one of them and cursed them. And she said, "Captain Swain, you will fall to your death immediately. You will be cut off from life. Captain Robbins, because of your cruelty to the helpless, you will rot. Captain Williams, your life will be cut off in an instant. Joseph Ward, you will be consumed by vermin. And finally, Captain McDaniels, although you are wealthy, you will die lonely and a vagabond and a pauper." So this became kind of a joke, or people may have talked about this, and their trick worked because Granny left town. She didn't stay around. Her home was ruined. But then something weird started to happen. And one by one, the men died. The first to go was Captain Swain. He was cut off instantly. A tree fell on him while he was out in the woods. And when this happened, a young boy heard about it, ran into town and said, "Captain Swain is dead. A tree has fallen on him." And one by one, each man fell to ruin based on what the witch's prophecy was. Captain Robbins rotted. His extremities fell off his body. Joseph Ward was in fact a healthy man, but he was consumed by rodents. And when he lay in interment, they were so astounded and horrified by the amount of vermin that was in his body that they had to burn all of his bedding and his clothes. McDaniels was the last to go, and he lived in such paranoia and just almost a sense of guilt that he was afraid to leave his house because he thought every day was going to be his last day. And so he didn't leave his house. And because he didn't participate in any part of the community, eventually all his property was lost, and he really died with nothing left. He died a poor man. So one by one, they died just as Granny said that they would. And when the final bell tolled, the people in town thought, well, this is the end of this curse. So I had always wondered, is this true? I would like to find this place. And I began to talk to the people at the Historical Society in New Hampton. I'm actually going to do a presentation there next month. And they were able to tell me that the Granny Hyde was associated with a part of town that was known as Dark Hollow. And again, this is kind of ties in with this witch story. And about 2 years ago, back in about 2018, I'm reading a newspaper. It was the Weir's Time, and coincidentally, there was a story called Witch's Brew. So I'm reading the story, and it says, there was a woman, her name was Granny Hyde. And I was like, oh, this is the witch story. Somebody else has the same fascination with the witch story. And this was a journalist from New Hampton. His name is Robert Hannaford Smith. He writes for the Weir's Time and Laconia Times. And he was also just wanted to know if the story was real. And he started to do some genealogical research on who Granny Hyde might have been. Was she a real person? She was a real person. Her name was Esther Hyde. Her husband was John Prescott, and he died in the Battle of Bunker Hill. So her real name was Esther Hyde Prescott. And eventually Esther returned to the area of New Hampton, and lived there later in life, possibly beyond the time that she may have been considered a witch. She was part of the community. She had a son, and she's buried in the local cemetery. And I met Robert out in New Hampton, and it just happened to be on Halloween Day. It was just coincidentally that it was Halloween Day. And I said, Robert, I think I know where Granny's cellar hole is. And we walked out into the Pemigewasset River, where I had an idea that it might be part of Dark Hollow, and we were able to find her cellar hole. And this is what you're looking at in this picture, is the cellar hole of Granny Hyde's cottage. And that was really like, I found the cellar hole. It was a real event. This really did happen. And Granny Hyde died. Esther Prescott died in 1812. She was in her 60s when she died. So if you do the math, roughly around the time when she was widowed, she really was only maybe about 40, middle-aged, that we would call now maybe 38, 40 years old. So I'm bringing you this next story, which is also about witchcraft. And George Burroughs was sentenced to death during the Salem witch trials. He had lived in Salem, but had a lot of bad luck as in Salem. He was a minister. He had high honors from Harvard. He was not ordained. And he had trouble in town. His first wife died. Then his second wife died. And he owed money to the town, and the town wasn't paying him, and they gave him money to bury his second wife. And he must have just said, oh, screw this, I'm leaving Salem, I'm going to Maine. He went to Wells, Maine with his third wife and a brood of children, which consisted some from his second wife. So in 1692, a group of girls accused George of witchcraft, and Massachusetts constables rode up to arrest George in Wells, Maine, and to bring him back to Boston to face those charges and to face trial. And who knows what may have been going through George's mind, but he said, you know, I know this shortcut. This will take miles and miles off of our journey. And he took the constables down this road. It's actually in South Berwick, Maine. It's now named Witch Trot Road, and it's named because George Burroughs took this road actually to his execution. He was found guilty of witchcraft, and he was hung. He was the only accused witch of reciting the Lord's Prayer at the time of his hanging, which was supposed to prove that he wasn't a witch. But anyways, he was also the only man who was hung during the Salem witch trials. So it's a fascinating story about witches. And you can take a ride down Witch Trot Road. It's right close by to Portsmouth. This next story I'm going to talk to you about is probably one of the most popular stories in the book Haunted Hikes. It's out in West Chesterfield, New Hampshire. And I showed you where West Chesterfield is with that red star. It's just a short distance from Keene. It's maybe 15 minutes. And I first heard about this story from friends of mine at the New Hampshire Forest Society. They're an organization that I've worked with over the years, and I've just become very close to the people that work there. When I first had this idea to create a book and have it be ghost stories that are outside, I attended a conference, and the conference was called Leave No Child Inside. If you remember Leave No Child Behind, this was Leave No Child Inside. And it was a group of all kinds of organizations from New Hampshire getting together, educators, the Appalachian Mountain Club, Forest Society, kind of brainstorming ways about how we can get children to use less technology and go outside and explore nature more. And that's where I met Dave Anderson from the Forest Society. And he said, you know, I heard you're putting together a collection of ghost stories. Well, you have to know about Madame Sherri. The Madame Sherri Forest is a property owned by the New Hampshire Forest Society. It's located, just so happens, right on the Vermont border. It's a very small town. They have 2 cops. And here is Madame Sherri. She came from Paris, France, and she arrived in New York City in 1911 with her husband, Andre, who was much younger than her. So she was very much a sophisticated woman of the time. She sang in the cabaret in Paris, France, but her real talent was in designing costumes. So when they came to New York City, they opened up a costume shop on 42nd Street, and they did costumes for like the Ziegfeld Follies and much of the theater groups. And in New York City at that time, many of the musicians and the actors that were part of the theater, they would vacation at Spofford Lake in New Hampshire. This is where they went and they partied and they drank champagne and just had a good time. So Madame Sherri, her real name was Antoinette Delilas. She changed her name to be more glamorous to Madame Sherri. Madame really fell in love with the Spofford Lake area, and her husband died at a very young age, and so she was widowed from a very young age herself. But she decided that she wanted to buy property and build a chateau near Spofford Lake. And this way she could entertain guests. This would be her home away from the city. And she bought acres and acres of farmland on the side of Mount Wanastikut on the Vermont border in the town of West Chesterfield. And she had a chateau built. And it became the place to go. There was an elaborate staircase where Madame would appear at the top of the staircase in a glimmering gown with jazz piano music playing. The champagne glasses were clinking, and this was how she was in her element. She was just surrounded by friends and loved, and she was really very flamboyant and glamorous. There's all kinds of pictures of her. Many in the town of West Chesterfield were raising their eyebrows about her. She really didn't fit in with the normal crowd. And a lot of the townsfolk thought she was running a brothel. There were all kinds of rumors about what she was doing out in this house. And she was also known to drive around town in a big fur coat, high heels, pearl necklace, and nothing else on underneath the coat in her Packard. And so, again, that caused lots of gossip and commotion about who this woman was. So she didn't make many friends in town. And eventually, her money had run out. She had been supported in a lot of ways by New York wealth. And as she got older, she lost a lot of this investment. And she became very sick. She probably developed Alzheimer's. She was eventually put into an institution in Brattleboro, Vermont. And while she was in Brattleboro, her house was set on fire. It was it was vandalized. Furniture was stolen, paintings were stolen, and there was nothing left of her home. She died in 1965. Over time, the property changed hands over ownership, and it was privately owned until eventually, again, the New Hampshire Forest Society bought up about 600 acres of land, and it's land that you can visit and hike at, and there's many, many trails. What's left of the castle, locals call the Stairway to Heaven. And this is an iconic picture. You may see a ghost in there. And this staircase has shown up in all kinds of photographs. all kinds of, it's just a widely popular image, and it's a beautiful, beautiful place to go during the fall. And the first time I went out there, I was just astounded by what it feels like to be there. And people have seen and have reported the image of Madame Sherri, almost like a glowing orb or a glowing specter flowing down the staircase. People sometimes hear waltzing music. So there's been a number of reports. I've done book signings where people have shown up with photographs of pictures that they've taken at Madame Sherri Forest, where there's something definitely going on in the picture. And so it's really a magical place. However, as you might imagine, the staircase gets a lot of use and it's very old. And the Forest Society is really trying to discourage people from walking on the staircase, because if it collapses, that's it. It will not be rebuilt. That will be the end of the staircase. There's other ruins in the site. It's just, you can see archways. It's very Gothic looking. There's a chimney. There's a ghost in the chimney. And you can walk around the property and just really feel what this place was like. In 2014, my daughter was running cross country in Keene, and my brother wanted to go see Madame Sherri Forest and see the staircase. He'd never seen it before. So it was a Saturday in October, and I said to my brother, "Yeah, let's go. It shouldn't be too bad. We'll just go and see the castle. You got to see this place." And we drove out, and this is a dirt road. It's called like Gulf Road. And there was about 200 cars parked along Gulf Road. And I was thinking, like, what is going on here? Like, you're kidding me. So as it turned out, there was a Goth wedding taking place that day. And I always keep books in my car, and I gave the bride a copy of the book. And she was not in a happy mood. And I said, she had this purple gown on and, this black and purple makeup and stuff. And I said, oh, well, she's not too happy on our wedding day. That's too bad. But what I realized there were other actors and actresses there with photographers. And they were also doing photo scenes. And there was just a lot of competition for this bride. And, she, I think her wedding day kind of got rained on with all the other attention that the models were getting. So I felt bad for her. This is me with two of the actors, and it was taken by Monica Busher Photography. She's also out of the New Hampshire, Portsmouth area. And they brought with them, their whole entourage brought all of these Shakespearean costumes. They all dressed up and posed on the staircase. If you go to Monica Busher's website, you can see the series that she did when she was at Madame Sherri. And I spoke to her about it, and she said for a lot of professional photographers that the Madame Sherri Forest is like a bucket list. It's like the place to go to photograph. And so it really is a magical place. I got to wear one of the costumes. They had set up almost like a dressing area in the woods with all of these costumes. And I put this one on. It weighed about 50 pounds. It was really hard to walk back up the hill, but I was so excited to get photographed with these great actors. So next, we're going to the Lakes region, and we're not going to go to Bald Mountain in this segment. We're not going to go visit Sasquatch, but I do have a Sasquatch story in the book. And as you remember, the first picture of me with my first promo shot was a big Sasquatch behind me. And when I was first told the idea that I was going to have a story in a book about a Sasquatch, I was like, I don't know about that. Ooh. But it's actually been one of the more popular stories in the book, and people love the story. We are going to go to Devil's Den Mountain. It's in New Durham, and it's actually not very far from Portsmouth. It's up New Durham, past Durham, in on Merry Meeting Lake. So this is my daughter walking into the Devil's Den, and that is my dog Ruby not going into the Devil's Den because she was too scared. And the Devil's Den is located within a mountain, and it's Devil's Den Mountain. The Devil's Den is a cave, and the story goes that this mountain is very small. It's only 1,100 feet. It's very easy to climb to the top of. When it was purchased, the landowner discovered that his property had this mountain, and there was a cave. Inside the cave were bones, human bones. So there was all kinds of speculation about who these bones belonged to. Were they some sort of prisoner of the Revolutionary War? How did these bones get here? And it sort of became part of the allure of going to see the cave. So the property owner charged an admission fee for anybody to go out and go inside the cave. And people did. They wanted to see this cave. And part of the legend that goes with it is that at night, if you put your hands against the side of the walls of the cave, you can feel cold blood oozing through the cracks. This is my younger daughter. She was about 10 when this picture was taken. And when I show this picture to students, they'll say, "Miss O'Connor, is that a ghost that's right in front of Lynn's mouth?" And it isn't. The cave is so dark inside that you really need a headlamp, but we didn't know that. And so we just put our flashlights in our mouth, and that's what you're seeing there is her moving around inside the cave with a flashlight. And it's a really cool cave. If you've ever explored caves before, it's kids really get into it. It's so much fun. It's obviously very dark and it's cold inside, but one thing that's unique about this cave, it's about 15 feet deep. So you actually are walking into this cavern, this very dark cavern. It's been known to be a little bit of a party spot, and the first time I found it, I was told, "Oh, you know, when you see the Budweiser can on the top of the tree, that's when you know you're at the cave." So police do try to keep it, you know, not so crazy. But it's a lot of fun. At the very end of the cave, there's a rope ladder that comes down from a hole at the very top of the summit of Devil's Den Mountain, and you can climb up the rope ladder and actually climb on top of the summit, and there you are. That's very fascinating. So that was such a fun day to explore the Devil's Den cave. We didn't feel any blood dripping through the cracks. So we are going to travel next to the White Mountains of New Hampshire. And I'm going to try to get through these stories quickly. Many people have seen and heard things that are so unusual, they defy explanation. And so I'm going to take you on a couple of these stories. And as I said in the beginning, I first started hiking with my father in the White Mountains when I was a teenager. I have the distinction of many of you where I'm the only girl in the family, and the boys had all the fun, and my father would take my brothers hiking, and I wouldn't get to go because I was a girl, or at least that's what I believed. And I was jealous, and I said, "I want to go. Why don't you ever invite me?" And so my father said, "Okay, you can come on the next trip, but you can't complain. And if you complain, then you won't ever be invited again." And so I never complained. And so I was it really opened me up to trips to the White Mountains, to everything that the Appalachian Mountain Club does and the hut system. And I would start to hear stories, especially on Mount Washington and the presidential range, about ghosts. And that's what we're going to explore next. So we're going to start, like I said, with the Appalachian Mountain Club and the huts in the high summit. And here are 3 huts here. There are 8 huts in the presidential range of the White Mountains. And we're going to visit 3 of them. The Lakes of the Clouds hut on the top there is the hut that's right below Mount Washington. The Greenleaf hut is right in the middle, and that's on Mount Lafayette. And Garter Notch Hut is in the Garter Mountain Range, just off of Garter Notch Mountain. And that's where we're going to start our first story. So the ghost of Red Mac at Garter Notch Hut. When you walk into the foyer at Garter Notch, you see a photograph. It was taken around the time of 1918. And in the picture is Joe Dodge, who is really, he was really the name and the face of the hut system in the White Mountains. He was behind everything. He was a man with had a lot of power, and he just had visions of establishing this hut system. And in 1914, work began on the Garter Notch Hut. And Red Mac, his real name was Milton McGregor. He was from Massachusetts. He went up to take place in the construction of Garter Notch Hut. So this is an actual picture that the AMC shared with me with permission from them, and it's from 1914. And as Red Mac was working on the hut, his nickname was Red Mac, he began to look around him and say, this is the most beautiful place on earth. In fact, when I die, this is my heaven. Garter Notch is my heaven. This is where I want to be. So years went on, and the hut system became very popularized, very popular. That everyone is probably most familiar with the Lakes of the Clouds hut. But Garter Notch Hut was the first hut that the AMC decided to keep open in winter time. And it was the 1970s. And this was a new idea. Let's see if we have hikers who want to do winter hiking who will go out and stay at Garter Notch Hut. And the man that was in charge of running the hut that first winter that they opened was named Joe Gill. Joe Gill is still alive, and he works for the Forest Society up in the White Mountains. He works for the White Mountain National Forest. So Joe Gill was a young guy at the time in the 70s, and he was often alone at Garter Notch Hut because it was the first winter, and there was no internet, and there was no way of really getting the word out or spreading the word amongst hikers that the hut was open. And in one night in March, Joe Gill was sleeping in his quarters in the hut master's room. And these huts that exist in the White Mountains are extremely rustic. There is no electricity, there is no plumbing. There are outhouses and bunk beds, and you are on your own. Nothing much has changed since 1914. So Joe was asleep. He was the only one at the hut that night. And suddenly the door opened, and in blasted snow and wind, and the curtains and his bedding all just blew up. And as Joe was trying to figure out what was going on, there was a figure standing over him. The figure picked up the flashlight that was sitting on the table next to Joe, and the figure shined the flashlight into Joe's eyes, blinding him. And Joe thought, I have a visitor. Who is this? What do you want? He's a little annoyed, but he's trying to see if this person needs a bed. Maybe they're so cold they can't speak. And he says, how can I help you? Can I get you something to eat? Can I get you some tea? And there's no response. And suddenly, as Joe is trying to get his bearings straight, he realizes that the flashlight has suddenly moved to the other corner of the room and is sitting on a table face up to the ceiling. And Joe gets up and he is looking around for whoever this person is. He has to shut the door to stop the wind from coming in, and he's calling and he's looking around. He doesn't see anybody. And finally, he believes that he's alone in the hut, so he goes back to sleep. And he's just thinking, this is the weirdest thing that's ever happened. So the next day he goes down the trail. It's about a 3.5 mile hike down from Garter Notch all the way to Pinkham Notch. And he went to the Joe Dodge Lodge, which is right where Mount Washington base is. And he sees other crew members from the AMC, and he starts to tell his story. And he says, you're never gonna believe what happened to me last night, but some guy came in the hut, left the doors open, all the bedding went flying everywhere, and he shined a flashlight in my face, and then he left. And people are sort of looking around mysteriously going, Joe, did you hear what happened last night? Last night, news of Milton McGregor's death had reached the Joe Dodge Lodge. Red Mac had died. And so it's believed that Red Mac, just as he had promised, returns to Garter Notch, which was his heaven. So people have seen Red Mac. They have seen his lantern. He is known to walk in the woods with his lantern, but most often what people report is hearing his footsteps on the roof. And whoops, I'm going to go back to that slide. A boyfriend that I had from Newmarket many years ago, he's not around anymore, we went to stay at Garter Notch Hut in the middle of winter time. We went in January. It was freezing, and we stayed overnight, and we hiked Garter Dome in the morning and brought up our own food and everything. And we really wanted to have an experience where we heard Red Mac on the roof or we saw something, but I was so scared to leave my bunk bed. The bunk bed is like separate, the bunks are separate from this part of the hut, that I wouldn't dare like walk out or use the restroom or anything. I just was like, oh my God, I'm too scared. But we didn't hear his footsteps. But my nephew, they went up a year later and he claims he heard the footsteps. So Mount Washington is haunted. It is definitely haunted. I know of many stories that have happened on Mount Washington, and even still to this day, I hear other stories. The presence is an energy that some people believe embody many of the people who died on Mount Washington. And if you visit Mount Washington, either by the Cog Railway or from the auto road, or if you hike, you will see death markers. There are a number of death markers that mark the places where people have perished, they have died. There's a terrible tragedy that happened in 1901 where 2 men from a New York hiking club died on June 30th, 1901 in a snowstorm. So the weather and the conditions on Mount Washington make it extremely hazardous. Things change. The weather changes. It becomes very cloudy. The visibility is really low. The wind is sometimes ferocious, and many people have died. There's a great book by Julie Beardman called Death in the White Mountains and how to not be one. And I highly recommend it. So this is the Lakes of the Clouds hut, the hut that's on Mount Washington. This is a story of Ben Campbell, and he was a hut manager at the Greenleaf Hut, which was at Mount Lafayette. But his lifelong dream was to be the hut manager at Lakes of the Clouds. And this is what a lot of the AMC crew members aspire to, is to be a hut manager. And he was a hut manager at Lafayette. He went on a vacation with his parents to do some research in Scotland on their roots and their genealogy and their family. They went on a hike, and Ben had an accident and he fell and died. When the family came back to New England, they wanted to honor the AMC because Ben Campbell's life was the AMC. This was his dream. He was really living his dream, and his family wanted to make sure that the AMC knew how special Lafayette was, the AMC crew, and especially the Greenleaf Hut. So they presented the AMC crew members with Ben's hiking boots as a token of thanks. And the idea was that these hiking boots could sit at the fireplace or be on display someplace as a memorial to him, that this really was his favorite place in the whole world. Well, something weird began happening with the boots, and they began walking around by themselves. And even though they'd be placed near the fireplace, suddenly they were now in the bunk rooms. Now they were outside. Now they walked themselves over to the kitchen area. And the crew members at Greenleaf were like, oh my gosh, what are we going to do? We can't give the boots back to the family. That would be really rude. What should we do with these boots? They're walking around on their own. So someone had an idea, and they said, well, you know, Ben Campbell really wanted to be a hut manager at the Lakes of the Clouds hut. So let's give the boots to those guys. They can have the boots, and maybe the boots won't walk around anymore. So that's what they did. The Lakes of the Clouds hut accepted Ben's boots, and they said, well, we're not going to have this problem anymore. We're not going to have Ben's boots walking around. So they nailed his boots to the wall. And that's where they are. They're in the crew room at the Lakes of the Clouds hut. And if you go and visit, you can say, hey, I want to see Ben Campbell's boots. And they will show you the boots. And they don't walk around anymore. Only sometimes. I had told this story at Joe Dodge Lodge on Halloween many years ago, probably about 8 years ago. And I'd been invited to do a Halloween special, and I told this story. And at the end of every program that I do, people are, they line up, they want their book signed. And there was a guy standing at the end of the line, and I noticed him right away because he kept wanting to be the last man in line. I was like, okay, you know, I see what you're doing. So finally he's the last man in line, and he comes up to me and he said, I really wanted to hear your story about Ben Campbell. I was really interested in how you presented the story because Ben Campbell was my friend. He was a friend of mine. And my knees turned to noodles. I was just like, oh my God, I can't believe this. And he said, you know, you're pretty accurate. That's really, you know, how the story went. The boots went to the Lakes of the Clouds, and they nailed the boots to the wall. But you've forgotten to mention that sometimes Ben's ghost, his shadow, he's a shadow person, is sometimes seen at the Greenleaf Hut, and he appears to be looking for something. He opens things. His shadow can be seen looking underneath beds or looking through closets. And I said, I hope he's not looking for his boots, because his boots are not at that hut anymore. So this is the story that's a little bit scary. This is the inside of the dining room at the Lakes of the Clouds. And it seats about 90 people. About 90 people can eat a meal here. And in the spring and the summer and the fall, the windows that you see in the dining room are open, and on a nice clear day, you can see for miles and miles. It's just gorgeous. The Lakes of the Clouds hut does not stay open in wintertime. The weather on Mount Washington is too brutal. And so in winter, probably going on right about now, Lakes of the Clouds hut closes down for the season. It shuts down, the windows are boarded, and it's locked until the next season. But as the tradition goes, in the spring, somebody is assigned the duty to walk up to the hut in the snow just to make sure there's no damage, check on the hut, make sure everything looks good. So this job fell to a man named George, who was part of the AMC crew. And one spring day, he loaded up his radio so that he could talk back to the base, loaded his backpack with some fuel, and he headed up with his keys to open up and assess any damage that might have happened in the wintertime. And this whole time he's communicating back to the base that, you know, I'm here, I've arrived, I'm gonna go inside. But soon the base lost contact with George. He wasn't answering. And hours went by and they didn't hear from him. So there was worry about what may have happened to George. So the next day, he still hadn't radioed in, and they put together a search crew to go up and see what has happened to George. So another group of AMC workers goes up to the hut, and they find the hut door open. They see George's backpack on one of the tables. The windows are still boarded up because it's not quite open for the season. And there's no sign of George. And they start calling him and they're saying, George, where are you? Hey, what's going on? Are you okay? And finally somebody spots him hiding underneath the sink, and he's got an axe in his hands. And all he says over and over again, get me the hell out of here. Get me the hell out of here. George, what happened? Oh my God. Just get me the hell out of here. So they get him out. They bring him to the hospital. They're trying to figure out what has spooked him so much. What is he seeing? Was it an animal? Was it a bear or something? So finally, he doesn't speak about what's happened, but he tells his brother. And what he tells his brother is he had arrived inside the dining room, put his backpack down, got himself out some granola, something to eat. And he said he began to have a feeling that somebody was watching him. And some of us have had that feeling before. It's very unsettling. You think that someone's watching you, but there's no one here. How could that be? George was under this intense pressure that somebody or something was watching him. He couldn't shake it, and he didn't want to look up. He just kind of froze. And as he looked up, he looked at each of the windows, and what he saw frightened him. He saw a face. And it was the same face in every window, over and over again. And if you remember, the windows are boarded up. So wherever this face is, it's coming between the boards and the glass. And as George watched these faces, they seemed to almost melt the glass and ooze into the room. And that's why he hid under the sink. And he never returned to work for the AMC ever again. So this may have been an experience of the presence. Sometimes the presence can be a sinister presence, but I've spoken to a lot of AMC members who claim that the presence is a warm, benevolent, blue glow that they feel comforted by. So it's taken on different forms, and people describe it in different ways. So my next story is actually in Maine, and it is about the ghost of Catherine. I'm going to go back to that last slide. The ghost of Catherine I first heard about from Marcus Librizzi's book, Chill Waters, Dark Woods. And it's Maine ghost stories. And I live in Maine now. I moved to Maine about 4 years ago. It's really, New Hampshire is still my home, but Maine is now my new home. And so I'm finding, like, I want to find the haunted hikes of Maine, because I know they're out there. So I read about the story about Catherine. She's a ghost, and there's a mountain named Catherine Mountain. And supposedly she died in a terrible accident. And part of the story is that she was with her beau, her lover, and they were in a carriage or in a car. It goes back and forth, and the car rolled down the hill. She was killed, and she lost her head. And so Catherine is seen, and is seen by many people, going up and down this highway where this accident took place. And the name of the highway is called the Black Woods Scenic Highway, and it's up and down East Maine, in Cherryfield, Maine. So people would see Catherine in the road, and sometimes she would have her head with her, on her head, and sometimes she'd be carrying her head in her hands. And the legend has it that if you see her, you stop and you ask her, do you need help? Do you need a ride? How can I help you? If you don't stop, something horrible will happen to you, and you think that you have left her behind, but look in your rearview mirror, and there she is sitting in the back seat of your car. So be sure to pick her up. I wanted to go and see if I could find the ghost of Catherine myself. So this summer, I traveled with my dog to Cherryfield, Maine. It's about 20 miles from Bar Harbor. I stayed a couple of nights, and I hiked Catherine Mountain. And some eerie things did happen to me while I was on the mountain. And there's a throne, it's what they call a throne, at the top of the summit where you can sit and gaze upon the earthly delights. And that's my dog that hikes with me. It's Bella. And I visited the Catherine Hill Winery, and they've had visitors who have also seen the ghost of Catherine there. So I didn't see Catherine, but I did have some unusual things happen while I was on the mountain. And I was the only one on the mountain, and I did hear sort of voices or somebody laughing. This will be my last story. This is The Lost Love of Nancy Barton. And Nancy worked for Colonel Whipple in Jefferson, New Hampshire. She was about 16. She was engaged to be married to Jim. Jim's supposed last name was Swindle, so you can kind of see where this story is going. And I read about this story of Nancy in Lucy Crawford's book, The History of the White Mountains. Because when this story happened, it was so sad and so tragic that people just didn't know what to do with their grief. Nancy was supposed to be married to Jim, and she gave Jim her dowry money to hold on to while they were engaged. Jim also worked on Colonel Whipple's farm. Colonel Whipple, for whatever reason, did not approve of the marriage, and he convinced Jim to leave Jefferson and enlist as a soldier in the Revolutionary War. Colonel Whipple's brother was part of the Revolutionary War effort. He was also, I think, a captain. He was actually, the brother signed the Declaration of Independence. You can see his signature on there. Nancy learned that Jim left with her dowry money, and she was very feisty, and she said, you know, I'm not going to let this happen. He's not going to get away with this. I'm going to find him. He's going to get it for me. So this was in December, and it was cold and it was snowy, and Nancy left the manor in Jefferson in search of Jim and the Colonel. And she knew that she was on their trail because they had left some campfires, and she just thought that she would catch up to them. Now this is Crawford Notch in the winter time. She was not prepared. She did not have warm clothing on. And when she did not return to the manor, people began to get worried about her. And again, a small search party formed to try to find her. When they found her, she was sitting on a rock with her chin resting on her fist like this, and she was completely frozen to death. Where she had been found was only about a quarter mile from the Crawford house. Had she been able to get a little bit more walking in, she would have found shelter and warmth. Most likely, she got wet. She was wearing a long dress. The bottom of her dress, any part of her cotton clothing would have got wet, and this would have resulted in hypothermia. And so she was buried in the spot where her body was found. And so there's a grave that you can visit, and this is what it looks like. It's actually in Crawford Notch, and as this story happened, there was a need to really honor who Nancy was. And so this whole area of where her body was discovered is called the Nancy Mountain Scenic Area. And there's the Nancy Cascades, Nancy Mountain, Nancy Path, and this is where her body was buried. What's interesting about the ghost of Nancy, and Lucy Crawford speaks of this because her inn was located right where Nancy's body was found, so it affected her personally, was she felt that she could hear Nancy's cries and wailing in the woods. Part of the legend goes that poor Jim was so destroyed by the news of Nancy dying that he was guilt-stricken and ended up committing suicide. But Nancy's cries can be heard in the woods. And it's a beautiful place to visit in Crawford Notch. But if you hear crying, you're probably hearing the ghost of Nancy. And I'll tell you one last story. And Nancy Mountain was the last mountain that I worked my GPS on. My publisher really wanted me to do my own maps and gather data by taking a GPS and getting my own tracks and working with a cartographer. And I put off Nancy Mountain because it was daunting to me. And finally, I'm like, oh, I just got to do this. It was February, and I had a deadline. So my father and I went out to Nancy Mountain in the winter, put on my snowshoes. I had my dog with me. It was freezing. And I started hiking up the Nancy Brook Trail, and I realized that the batteries of my GPS was dead. And I'm in Bartlett, New Hampshire. There's like, I can't go to a CVS and get new batteries. It's just like, oh, this is just my luck. And as I was standing there doing nothing and feeling sorry for myself, I heard thump, 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 thump. These two guys are coming down the trail. These two big guys with big beards and big, huge packs with pots and pans and ice axe picks hanging from the side. And one of them had a GPS on him. So I'm like, hey, you guys, oh my gosh, good to see you on the trail today. Hey, are you taking a track of Nancy Mountain? They said, oh, yes, we are. We're taking a track. We're camped up at Norcross Lake, and we're just coming back. But yeah, we took a track of the whole weekend. I said, great, can you email me that track? because I need that file. I can't get it today because my GPS ran out of batteries. Oh, yeah, no problem. And they did. And they said, well, you know, what do you want this for? And I started explaining, well, I'm working on a book and it's Haunted Hikes of New Hampshire, and Nancy Mountain is supposedly haunted. So one guy's kind of doing all the talking. And the quiet guy says, what do you mean? That, you know, what do you mean? I said, well, you know, so now I'm telling the whole story. I say, people hear Nancy crying at night. And the quiet guy says, oh my God, you're not going to believe this. I didn't sleep a wink. I didn't sleep a wink last night. I kept hearing a bird. I thought it was a bird, and I thought the bird was dying. And I kept leaving my tent looking around for like a wounded animal. But it's February, and I couldn't see anything. I just heard this awful crying all night long, and I didn't sleep. And we just kind of gave each other a look, and I said, maybe you heard the ghost of Nancy. And finally, here we go. Oh, I wanted to go back one. If I can. Nope. And that is the end of my program today. Thank you so much for listening and for being a part of this. And I think Laura might be able to open it up for any questions.
Do you want to stop your presentation, Marianne?
Yeah.
We can see.
I will get out of it. There we go.
Okay, well, I'm just going to open it right up. I mean, I have a couple of questions, but let's see if anybody else does, because no one's written them in the chat.
Am I on mute?
Nope. Can you hear me?
Can you hear me?
Yes, I can hear you. Can you hear me?
I can't hear you.
Uh-oh.
I can hear you, Laura.
Well, that's good. Let's wait and see if Marianne can get it sorted out.
I don't know why I can't
Marianne,
hear you.
Can you see me? Can you turn up your volume?
Oh. Got it.
Does that work?
Yes. Oh my
Okay,
goodness.
excellent. Great. So we do have a question in the chat, which is from Kim. And Kim asks, what is the easiest haunted hike that you would recommend?
There's a few of them. And when I first put the book together, we wanted to do sort of a guide that would say, you know, 1 ghost means easy, 2 ghosts is medium, that kind of, you know, 4 ghosts is like wicked hard. So there are a lot of 1 ghost hikes in the book. One of my favorite easy hikes is Monson Village, which is a ghost town. It's out in Milford, New Hampshire. I'm actually going to be going there with WMUR in a couple of days. And it's a very simple walk around. It's a self-guided tour. There are cellar holes. There's an old watchmaker's cabin that's been restored. And it's a beautiful place. And you can make it longer or shorter. There's maps and everything, but it's flat. There's really no hills. And the ones that I was working on in this last edition were, there's also a few very easy hikes. The one in Northampton is an easy hike. It's really on the Pemigewasset River, and it's just called the New Hampton Fitness Trail. And there's a series of stations, and you can stop and, you know, do your balance and that kind of thing. But it's just a nice, easy walk along the Pemigewasset River, not far from where the witch's cottage was. So that's also easy.
That's great.
So there's a few of them in there that's easy.
Thank you. We have another question, which is, do you have any stories about ghosts at the old family grave sites found deep in the woods?
There are so many family grave sites in the woods, and the one that comes to mind again was, you know, in talking about witches, there was the Glidden family plot has Sarah Glidden's grave. And this was the woman who was supposedly accused of being a witch in the 1800s. And so her grave and her gravestone, she died by being struck by lightning in Alton. And even though she was not ever, like, she was the wife of a deacon, but at the time, this was just a beautiful August day, and she was struck by lightning in front of a very large crowd. So everybody witnessed this agonizing, horrible death of this woman. And they saw this as a sign that she was the devil, or she had something to do with the devil. And they didn't want to bury her in the Christian cemetery, and they buried her in a different family plot. And over time, weird things started to happen with that grave. The gravestone itself was struck by lightning, and all kinds of weird electrical things happen in the homes that are along this place. So I'd like to learn of some more, especially because I love the old family plots. That's the one that comes to mind. I also wanted to share with people that they can buy the book in Pickwick's, or they can get it online at Pathway Books, and I have a link for that.
I already threw it in the chat.
Oh, good.
A couple times, yeah. And somebody did just ask that, where can you get the book? So I put a link to purchase the book in the chat, and it sounds like you can buy it at Pickwick's as well. And then if you want to check it out from the library, we have the first and the second edition. So there's a link to that in the chat as well.
Yeah. And what's different about the first and the second book is the first edition, the ink on the state of New Hampshire glows in the dark. And so, which was really a cool marketing thing at the time, that Publishing Works came up with this idea, and it was like, it became like the cool thing to have a glow in the dark book. And in the second edition we decided not to do that because the ink was expensive. So it's different.
So that's a collector's edition now.
Yeah, it is.
We have a couple of questions about hikes in the Portsmouth area, and so I know you mentioned one in Northampton and one in South Berwick. Is there anything that's closer to Portsmouth or right in Portsmouth? I know we have some ghost stories, but any hikes or walks here?
The Devil's Den in New Durham is the one that's closest that I can think of. I've always really wanted to find something in the Portsmouth area, and I would say, the thing that I would suggest is Roxy Zwicker. She's also a good friend of mine. She does a lot of these haunted graveyard tours, and she has a couple of books out on haunted graveyards in Portsmouth. So I would think that she might have. She's more familiar with the area than I am.
That's great. Oh, and this is a good time for me to plug that we have a monthly genealogy workshop, and actually October's genealogy workshop is with the Graveyard Girls, who will be talking about how to gather clues from gravestones, if that's something you're into. So I'll pop a link to that in the chat as well. Oh, look, let me just see if, okay, good. I have a question, which is, what is the most scared that you ever were doing research for this book?
So this is an interesting story. I've written for Hippo Press. I've been a contributor over the years to the Hippo, and as a recreation writer. And at the time that I was really putting stories together, I was also, writing little feature articles for the Hippo. And it happened to be like right around Black History Month, and I found out that there were 2 mountains in New Hampshire that were named after former Black slaves. And this is an unusual thing. And so I wanted to do a little bit of research on that and write about it in the Hippo. And so one of the mountains is in Newport, New Hampshire, and it's called Coit Mountain. And Vance Coit had been a slave. He was freed, and he had a common law wife who was white, and they lived on this mountainside, which is now bears his name. But although many of the people in the town liked him and accepted him, there were people in town who didn't. and there were many men who wanted to run him out of town, and they would plant farm equipment on his property and claim that he stole the farm equipment. And so he was publicly whipped for being a thief. And eventually it caused a stir. He was publicly lashed, and his common law wife was with him and stood by him with a bowl of rum, and every time he bled, she would take the sponge from the bowl of rum and douse his wounds. And when the whipping was over, as an act of defiance to the townspeople who hurt him, she drank the bowl of bloody rum. And this was like, whoa, oh my God. And so this became this very outrageous thing that happened. And eventually Vance and his wife, they did leave the area. They just felt unwelcome, and they left. However, what happens is there has been a phantom on Coit Mountain, and many believe the phantom is actually Vance Coit. So I didn't know this story when I went out there. This is what I learned afterward. I'm just kind of interested in who was Vance Coit and how did he get a mountain named after him. And so it was winter time, and I was hiking on this mountain, and it's all kinds of trails. Next to Coit Mountain is Pinnacle Mountain, and it's a big mountain biking system. They do all kinds of races there. It's all kinds of bike trails. It's a great place to go mountain biking as well as hiking. So I expected that I would see somebody, but I never saw anybody while I was out on this trail. But out of the corner of my eye, I kept seeing somebody run by me really fast. And I would be like, oh, there is somebody here. They're really moving fast. That's weird, but maybe I'll catch up to them. And because I really, I've never been here. I want to talk to somebody. That's part of the experience I like to have. Tell me about this place. What do you like? How are the trails here? And I would see this flash of a person just go by me. And I would think, how come I'm not running into them? It should make sense that our paths are going to cross. This is wintertime. There's no leaves in the trees. I can clearly see that this person is here. And I'm actually trying to catch up to this person. But then I would see him on the other side moving very fast. And I probably saw this about 3 times. And I was just baffled that it was an unusual thing, and it was kind of scary. And so I just thought, I didn't know what to think. I just was like, maybe somebody was out here running. And it happened to be a Sunday that I was out there. The town trails are managed by the rec department, which is very common. So I called the town of Newport rec department the next day, and the director there, he's a lovely man. His name is PJ Lovely. He's still the director there. And I said, hey, PJ, I was out on the trails on Coit Mountain and Pinnacle, and oh, what a great trail system. I said, by the way, I'm working on a book called Haunted Hikes of New Hampshire. And is there any unusual things that happen in Coit Mountain? And there's this silence on the phone. Yeah, it's funny you should ask that question. Yeah, it's funny you should ask that. But we do have reports of a phantom, a dark phantom that runs through the woods, that people feel they're chased by this phantom. And the theory is that the phantom, the spirit, is Vance Coit chasing people off his mountain and making sure no one comes on his mountain to do anything bad to his mountain. So it was a little unsettling to me, and I don't know what I saw. It's hard to say that if I saw a face on this person. I just knew it was a person or a figure, and they were moving very fast. So I may have seen the ghost of Vance Coit.
That's a good story.
And then it just made it into Haunted Hikes of New Hampshire because it's a ghost story. So.
Yeah. Does anyone else have questions for Marianne? You can type them in the chat, or if you'd like to unmute yourself, you can also ask them. Well, I think we might be wrapping it up. Marianne, is there anything else you wanted to talk about?
Yeah, I just wanted to really say thank you to all of you for listening and for being part of the audience today. And also, I want to thank Peter Randall Publishing. They put together the second edition of Haunted Hikes of New Hampshire. And if you had have told me 15 years ago that I would have a book, that I would be speaking to audiences, I would have told you to go count your brain cells. I didn't think this was ever going to be possible for me. But it was definitely a risk to take, but I wanted to publish a book. I really had that goal in my life. And I mean, look at me, I'm a very ordinary, average person, but I happen to have an interest in hiking and in ghost stories. And when I first worked with Publishing Works, they helped me really create a brand. And that's been something that has lent to the success of the book just staying alive for so many years, for 12 years. And when I began working with Peter Randall in Portsmouth, they also share that same dedication to want to help authors and illustrators and artists come up with their own brand, and how you can do that and how you can achieve that. And I urge you to go to their website. It's peterrandallpublishing.com, and look at their line of books and see what they do, because anybody can really, a lot of people I know want to publish. Right after I published my book, my 84-year-old dad published a book of fiction about baseball minor leagues in the New England area. And, he put together 200 copies. But the team at Peter Randall they're just fabulous, and they work with you, whatever your vision is, and they have editors, they market it, they can do all kinds of cover designs, and so I'm really grateful that I've worked with them. They're local, and you can go and see how other people have taken that and come up with their own creations. So I encourage you to visit them, and they're wonderful people too. So it's
That's
been great to
great.
work with them.
Thank you so much, Marianne. It was so awesome having you. I feel like I learned so much, and it was very spooky.